You know, as we stand here tonight, later than the typical hour for the Senate being in session, indeed later than many members of this body had anticipated being in Washington, D.C. Many members of this body had envisioned being on planes and returning home by now. But it occurs to me that those senators who have heeded the encouragement of the Twitterverse to stand with Rand, those senators who have come here today, I am reminded of Henry V. As Shakespeare observed, "What's he that wishes so, my cousin Westmoreland? No, fair cousin. If we are marked to die, we are enow to do our country's loss. And if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honor. God's will, I play thee, wish not one man more. By Jove, I am not covetous for gold, nor care I who doth feed upon my cost. It yearns me not if men my garments wear. Such outward things dwell not in my desires. But if it be a sin to covet honor, I am the most offending soul alive. No faith, my cuz, wish not a man from England. God's peace, I would not lose so great an honor as one man more methinks would share from me. For the best hope I have, oh, do not wish one more. Rather proclaim it, Westmoreland, through my host, that he which hath no stomach to this fight, let him depart. His passport shall be made, and crowns for convoy put into his purse. We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us. This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand a tiptoe when this day is named and rouse him at the name of Crispian. He that shall live this day and see old age will yearly on the vigil feast his neighbors and say, tomorrow is St. Crispian. Then he will strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispian's day. Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot. But he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names familiar in his mouth as household words. Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world, when we in it shall be remembered, we few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed that they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, whilst any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. I would observe to the senator of Kentucky that those glorious sentiments expressed centuries ago are precisely applicable to the stand here tonight, because it is a stand against high odds. Indeed, it is a stand against an administration that refuses to acknowledge limits on its power. And it is a stand for the same purpose, for liberty. There is a frustration across this country, a frustration not with Democrats or Republicans, not with one party or the other, a frustration with entrenched politicians in Washington who don't seem to work for anybody. I'm convinced there's something incredible happening in this country, that the people are standing up and reminding the men and women of this body that every one of us works for we the people. And it is our principal task to stand and defend liberty, especially when liberty is threatened. Indeed, that St. Crispian's Day speech had a same, and even in some ways a different manifestation in one of the greatest movies of all time, Patton. The opening scene of Patton, I will confess to the senator of Kentucky, I have more than once, in preparation for an oral argument in court, simply watched George C. Scott marching out in front of a flag the size of North Dakota. Standing in front of the flag, General Patton observed in a tribute to that very same speech I just read, and I'm going to modify it slightly to make it PG. Men, I want you to remember that no fellow ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor fellow die for his country. Men, all this stuff you've heard about America not wanting to fight, wanting to stay out of the war, is a lot of horse dung. Americans traditionally love to fight. All real Americans love the sting of battle. When you were kids, you all admired the champion marble shooter, the fastest runner, big league ball players, the toughest boxers. Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. Americans play to win all the time. I wouldn't give a hoot in hell for a man who lost and laughed. That's why Americans have never lost and will never lose a war, because the very thought of losing is hateful to Americans. George C. Scott continued his Patton. There's another thing I want you to remember. I don't want to get any messages saying we are holding our position. We're not holding anything. Let the other side do that. We're advancing constantly. We're not interested in holding on to anything except the enemy. We're going to hold him by the nose and kick him in the posterior. We're going to kick the heck out of him all the time. We're going to go through him like through a goose. 30 years from now, when you're sitting around the fireside with your grandson on your knee, and he asks you, "What did you do in the Great World War II?" You won't have to say, "Well, I shoveled manure in Louisiana." That same sentiment, the same sentiments in St. Crispian Day, talked about a tradition that has been a tradition in America for centuries, of men and women rallying together to fight for freedom, rallying against hard odds, rallying against challenging obstacles. And I would observe that that fight should not be a partisan fight. This is not a question of Republican or Democrat. Liberty, the right to life of every American citizen from arbitrary taking at the hands of the federal government, should not simply be a value that one side or another of this chamber embraces. Indeed, I would note, during the hearings this morning with Attorney General Eric Holder, some of the most enthusiastic audience participants in that hearing were self-identified members of Code Pink, who I would suggest are not ordinarily individuals who would be described as card-carrying members of the Republican Party. But liberty does not have a partisan affiliation. Indeed, to the senator from Kentucky, I think it is an interesting question what the reaction in this chamber and outside would be if the very same statements that have been made were made by a president who happened to be Republican. I think there is little doubt that the outcry would be deafening, and rightly so. And I will say to the senator from Kentucky, if a president made the identical representations and happened to have an R behind his or her name, I have not one shadow of a doubt that the senator from Kentucky would be standing here 10 hours in, protesting the arbitrary assertion of power by a president, regardless of whether we share his party or not. Indeed, I would note to the senator from Kentucky, this is a scenario which is not entirely hypothetical. Prior to serving in this body, I had the great privilege of serving my home state of Texas as the Solicitor General of Texas. And during that time, we faced a tragic and epic battle in a case called Medellin versus Texas. Medellin began with a crime that really shocked the conscience. 2 little girls were horrifically abused and murdered by a gang in Houston. They were apprehended, they confessed, and they were convicted by a jury of their peers, quite rightly. At that point, the case took a very, very strange turn because the World Court, which is the judicial arm of the United Nations, issued an order to the United States to reopen the convictions of 51 murderers across this country, including one of the murderers in this case, Jose Ernesto Medellin. Now, I will tell you, Jose Medellin wrote a 4-page handwritten confession in that case. It's one of the most chilling documents I've ever had the displeasure of reading. In it, he bragged about hearing those little girls beg for their lives. A tiny detail he included in those letters was in many ways the most haunting, and I know it will remain with me for the rest of my life. He described how the youngest of those girls was wearing a Mickey Mouse watch and how he kept it as a trophy of that night because he was so proud of the atrocities they had committed. It was truly sickening what those young boys did that evening. And yet, the World Court asserted a power that heretofore has never been asserted. It was the first time in history a foreign court has ever tried to bind the U.S. justice system. The World Court claimed the authority to reopen those convictions, and so Texas stood up and fought the World Court. I had the honor of arguing this case twice in front of the United States Supreme Court. On the other side, we had 90 foreign nations that came in against the state of Texas. 90 nations came in and argued that the United States justice system should be completely subject to the authority of the World Court and the United Nations. And also on the other side, most disturbingly, was the President of the United States. The President signed a 2-paragraph order that attempted to order the state courts to obey the World Court. Again, that order, like the World Court's order, was unprecedented. It was the first time in history any president has ever attempted to order the state courts to do anything. Unfortunately, the president at issue in that case was a Republican. It was President George W. Bush, a man for whom I worked, a man who in many respects I respect. And yet, in that case, he asserted a power that could be found nowhere in the Constitution. And in consultation with my boss at the time, Attorney General Greg Abbott, I went before the United States Supreme Court and argued on behalf of the state of Texas that the President of the United States has no authority to give away U.S. sovereignty. Now, that was done notwithstanding the fact that the President was a Republican, notwithstanding the fact that the President was the former governor of my home state of Texas. Because at the end of the day, defending liberty, defending sovereignty, defending the Constitution is not a partisan choice. It's not a game of dodgeball with shirts and skins, that if your team happens to have the ball, you all stick together. Every one of us has taken an oath of office, and we have an obligation to stand up. And so I stood before the U.S. Supreme Court representing the state of Texas, arguing that no president of the United States, be he Republican or Democrat, has the authority to give up U.S. sovereignty and make the state courts subject to the world court. Now, I would note in that case, the state of Texas had support from a number of unlikely sources. Indeed, we had a wide range of amici, of friends of the court, who came in and supported us. One brief was filed on behalf of law professors. It was joined by several law professors, one of whom, John Yoo, is widely considered the law professor with the most expansive view of presidential authority, and indeed was an individual who served in the Justice Department and had advocated under President Bush an expansive view of presidential authority. That very same brief was joined by Erwin Chemerinsky, the dean of the University of California at Irvine School of Law. Dean Chemerinsky is a very well-known and proud liberal academic. I suspect it may well be right that this is the only time ever that John Yoo and Erwin Chemerinsky joined a single brief before the U.S. Supreme Court. And both of them agreed, despite the fact that they come from very, very different places in the legal academy. Both of them agreed that unchecked power in the hand of the executive is fundamentally a threat to liberty. And indeed, I would note to the senator from Kentucky that in talking with both of them and in asking for their support in Medellin, I made the point to each, imagining a president from the other side who might have the power that was being asserted. To the friends of mine on the right, I suggested that if a president had the power to set aside state laws on grounds of international comity, which was the basis that was being asserted in that case, without any sanction from Congress, without any sanction from another branch of the federal government, simply on his own unilateral authority. To my friends on the right, I suggested that an activist president on the left could use that power to assert, for example, that in his or her judgment, the marriage laws of all 50 states should be set aside. Now, it may well be that all 50 states will choose to set their marriage laws aside. That is a judgment right now that has been in the hands of the voters in each state. But regardless of what the 50 states decided, I suspect they will not decide the same thing. It seems to me clear that no president has the authority unilaterally, with the flick of a finger, to remove laws from the state books of all 50 states. Likewise, to my friends on the left, I asked them to envision their nightmare of a right-wing president. They each had slightly different incarnations, but they all managed to do that. And I said, if this assertion of power is correct, that any president can set aside any state law if he or she deems it inconsistent with international comity, even though no treaty requires this, and indeed in Medellin, the Justice Department made clear no treaty required this. This was simply a power that was being asserted to further comity, to further our relationships with foreign nations. To my friends on my left, I suggested if the president has this power, what is to stop a president on the right from saying, I am setting aside the punitive damages laws in all 50 states. It upsets comedy when companies, foreign companies, are subject to punitive damages award. Therefore, tort reform shall be the law in all 50 states. And for that matter, there are states like California that persist in putting in place incredibly restrictive environmental laws. If the president has the authority to flick aside state laws, what would prevent a president on the right from saying those environmental laws are no more? Now, I would note to the senator from Kentucky that my view on all of those questions was very clear and very straightforward. No president may do so, whether he or she is of the right or of the left. If the federal government is to set aside a state law, it may do so only through exercise of the Supremacy Clause. And the framers required that in order to set aside a state law that had been adopted by the democratically elected legislature in the state, that two branches had to work together in concert, either through legislation that passes the House of Representatives, passes the United States Senate, and is signed into law by the president, or through the form of a treaty that is signed by the president and ratified by 2/3 of the United States Senate. But in both instances, the framers required two branches to work together. Why? Because of the same reason we discussed before. The reason from Federalist 10 that you do not want power unified in one branch of government where a faction, a special interest, may seize control of it. You want it divided. Now, I will note it was an unusual position for the state of Texas to appear before the United States Supreme Court and argue that an action by a Republican president and former governor of the state of Texas was unconstitutional. And yet I can tell you I was very proud to have the opportunity to do just that. And I was even more proud when the Supreme Court of the United States ruled by a vote of 6-3 in favor of the state of Texas, concluding, number one, that the World Court has no authority whatsoever to bind the United States justice system, and number two, that the president has no authority under the Constitution to give away our sovereignty. I would suggest that's the way our system's supposed to work, that all of us, regardless of party, should be standing together for liberty. And when I think of standing for liberty, some of the frustration that people have across this country is they feel it doesn't do any good. Doesn't make a difference who they vote for, whoever they vote for. They go to Washington, they keep spending money, and they spend more money and more money and more money, and the debt goes up and up and up and up, and the federal laws get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the federal regulations get more and more and more and more, and nothing seems to change. And I understand that frustration. It is a real frustration. It is a frustration I share, and I know it is a frustration the senator from Kentucky shares. And I would suggest that tonight, part of the import of tonight is that the senator from Kentucky is standing with millions of Americans who are frustrated by politicians in Washington who are unwilling to rock the boat, who are unwilling to stand for change. And I'm reminded that change can sometimes seem hopeless. Indeed, I mentioned that the desk I'm standing at was previously occupied by Barry Goldwater. I have yet to acquire, but I intend to acquire, a leather-bound copy of Conscience of a Conservative, which I intend to keep in this desk. When Barry Goldwater became a national leader, his views were thought impossible to receive a wide audience. The views instead that were in the ascendancy were the views of the left, that government control of the economy of our lives was the proper and right direction for our nation. And yet I'm reminded of someone else, like the senator from Kentucky, who gave a speech on October 27th, 1964. He said the following: I have spent most of my life as a Democrat. I recently have seen fit to follow another course. I believe that the issues confronting us cross party lines. Now, one side in this campaign, the campaign in 1964 for president, has been telling us that the issues of this election are the maintenance of peace and prosperity. The line has been used, we've never had it so good. But I have an uncomfortable feeling that this prosperity isn't something on which we can base our hopes for the future. No nation in history has ever survived a tax burden that reached a third of its national income. Today, 37 cents out of every dollar earned in this country is the tax collector's share. Ah, those were the days. And yet our government continues to spend $17 million a day more than the government takes in. Would that we could say today the government spends only $17 million a day more than it takes in. We haven't balanced our budget in 28 out of the last 34 years. We've raised our debt limit 3 times in the last 12 months. I will remind you this speech was given in 1964, not last week. And now our national debt is 1.5 times bigger than all the combined debts of all the nations of the world. We have $15 billion in gold in our treasury. We don't own an ounce. Foreign dollar claims are $27.3 billion. And we have just announced that the dollar of 1939 will now purchase 45 cents of its total value. Again, a scenario with which we are quite familiar. As for the peace that we would preserve, I wonder who among us would like to approach the wife or mother whose husband or son has died in South Vietnam and ask them if they think this is a peace that should be maintained indefinitely. Do they mean peace, or do they mean that we just want to be left in peace? There can be no real peace while one American is dying someplace in the world for the rest of us. We're at war with the most dangerous enemy that has ever faced mankind in his long climb from the swamp to the stars. And it's been said that if we lose that war, and in doing so lose this way of freedom of ours, history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent it from happening. Well, I think it's time we asked ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the Founding Fathers. This next section is a section particularly dear to my heart. It was given before I was born. Not too long ago, 2 friends of mine were talking to a Cuban refugee, a businessman who had escaped from Castro. And in the midst of his story, one of my friends turned to the other and said, "We don't know how lucky we are." And the Cuban stopped and said, "How lucky you are. I had some place to escape to." And in that sentence, he told the entire story. As I turn and see the junior senator from Florida, I know he and I both know, as I hope does every member of this body, just how precious and fragile the freedom is that we enjoy in this country. As President Reagan continued in that speech, if we lose freedom here, there's no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth. And this idea that government is beholden to the people, that it has no other source of power except the sovereign people, is still the newest and most unique idea in all the long history of man's relation to man. This is the issue of this election. Whether we believe in our capacity for self-government or whether we abandon the American Revolution and confess that a little intellectual elite in a far distant capital can plan for our lives better than we can plan them ourselves. You and I are increasingly told that we have to choose between a left or right. Well, I'd not like to suggest there's no such thing as left or right. There's only up or down. Up, man's old age dream, the ultimate in individual freedom consistent with law and order, or down to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. And regardless of their sincerity, their humanitarian motives, those who would trade freedom for security have embarked on this downward course. Given the topic of this discussion, the asserted power of the president to take the life out of a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil without due process of law, that last portion bears reading again. Those who would trade our freedom for security have embarked on this downward course to the ant-heap of totalitarianism. In this vote harvesting time, they use terms like the Great Society, or as we were told a few days ago by the President, we must accept a greater government activity in the affairs of the people. But they've been a little more explicit in the past and among themselves. And of all of the things I now will quote have appeared in print. These are not Republican accusations. For example, they have voices that say, quote, the Cold War will end through our acceptance of a not undemocratic socialism. Another voice says, the profit motive has become outdated. It must be replaced by the incentives of the welfare state. Or, quote, our traditional system of individual freedom is incapable of solving the complex problems of the 20th century. Senator Fulbright has said at Stanford University that the Constitution is outmoded. He referred to the president as, quote, our moral teacher and our leader. And he says he is hobbled in his task by the restrictions of power imposed on him by this antiquated document. Let me read that one again, too, because that also is very applicable to the discussion this evening. He referred to the president as, quote, our moral leader and our moral teacher and our leader. And he says he is, quote, hobbled in his task by the restrictions of power imposed on him by this antiquated document, the Constitution. He must, quote, be freed so he can do what he knows is best. And Senator Clark from Pennsylvania, another articulate spokesman, defines liberalism as meeting the material needs of the masses through the full power of centralized government. Well, I, for one, resent it when a representative of the people refers to you and me, the free men and women of this country, as, quote, the masses. That is a term we haven't applied to ourselves in America. But beyond that, the, quote, full power of our centralized government, this was the very thing the Founding Fathers sought to minimize. They knew that governments don't control things. A government can't control the economy without controlling people. And they know that when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. They also know, these Founding Fathers, that outside of its legitimate functions, government does nothing as well or as economically as the private sector of the economy. Now, we have no better example of this than government's involvement in the farm economy over the last 30 years. Since 1955, the cost of this program has nearly doubled. 1/4 of farming in America is responsible for 85% of the farm surplus. 3/4 of farming is out of the free market and has known a 21% increase in the per capita consumption of all its produce. And I'm going to skip further along. To the end of this speech, which I will confess, not unlike the speeches given on this floor, was not a short speech. I will move to the end where President Reagan continued and said, those who would trade our freedom for the soup kitchen of the welfare state have told us they have a utopian solution of peace without victory. They call their policy accommodation, and they say we'll only avoid any direct confrontation with the enemy. He'll forget his evil ways and learn to love us. We cannot buy our security, our freedom from the threat by committing an immorality as so great as saying to 1 billion human beings now enslaved behind the Iron Curtain, give up your dreams of freedom because to save your skins, we're making a deal with your slave masters. Alexander Hamilton said, "A nation which can prefer disgrace to danger is prepared for a master, and deserved one." Now let's set the record straight. There's no argument over the choice between peace and war, but there's only one guaranteed way you can have peace, and you can have it in the next second: surrender. Admittedly, there's a risk in any course we follow other than this, but every lesson of history tells us the greater risk lies in appeasement. And this is the specter that we face. You and I know and do not believe that life is so dear and peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery. If nothing in life is worth dying for, when did this begin? You and I have the courage to say to our enemies, there is a price we will not pay. There is a point beyond which they must not advance. And this is the meaning in the phrase of Barry Goldwater's Peace Through Strength. Winston Churchill said, "The destiny of man is not measured by material computations. When great forces are on the move in the world, we learn we're spirits, not animals." And he said there's something going on in time and space and beyond time and space, which, whether we like it or not, spells duty. You and I have a rendezvous with destiny. We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness. We will keep in mind and remember that Barry Goldwater has faith in us. He has faith in you and I to have the ability and the dignity and the right to make our own decisions and determine our own destiny. That path, the path of standing and fighting for freedom, even when it seems daunting, even when it seems the gestalt of the moment is on the other side, is a path with many honorable forebears. And I can tell you, speaking and echoing the sentiment of the millions on Twitter, of the people following this stand for principle tonight, that if the 100 senators of this body stand together and say, regardless of party, liberty will always prevail. Regardless of party, the Constitution is the governing body, the governing document in this nation. Then we will be doing our jobs. And I commend you, Senator Paul, for a lonely stand that, as the night has worn on, has not proven quite so lonely. And indeed, were you the only senator standing at his desk this evening, it would not be lonely in that circumstance either, because you would be standing shoulder to shoulder with millions of Americans that do not wish the federal government to assert arbitrary power over our lives, over our liberty, over our property, but who instead want a government that remains a limited government of enumerated powers, that protects the God-given rights each of us is blessed to have. And the question I ask of you, what, in your judgment, is America without liberty? Who are we if we are not a free people?